Hi, my name is Anna Hoffman, and welcome to this session as part of the Data Platform Summit 2021. I am super excited to be joining you all today, even if it is virtual. I thank you so much for spending time as part of the conference to come join me for this session. Now, this session is going to be focused on what's new in Azure SQL, and this is something I've been tracking all of this year, so all of this calendar year, I'm going to be going through some of the latest and greatest advancements we've made across the Azure SQL platform. Just a quick intro about myself. Again, my name is Anna Hoffman, and I am a data and applied scientist / program manager on the Azure data team, more recently focusing on Azure SQL. And if you want to stay up to date with what I'm doing on Twitter, YouTube, LinkedIn, whatever, you can reach me, you can find me, and I would love to connect. So that being said, you might be wondering, okay, so she's going to talk about what's new in Azure SQL, but what does Azure SQL entail? So just as a brief refresher, probably for most of you, Azure SQL contains the three main deployments of SQL Server running in Azure. So that starts with SQL Server in an Azure virtual machine, which is basically just SQL Server. You pick the SQL Server version, you pick the OS, you're responsible for upgrading, you're responsible for managing the OS, all that stuff. But we do some things to make it a little bit easier, and we can help you with some things related to availability and performance and scaling and configuration and security. Now, that's what we call infrastructure as a service, or IaaS. Then we have two PaaS services, or platform as a service services, Azure SQL Managed Instance, which is basically a managed SQL server. So if you need instance scoped capabilities, this is the way to go. That means things like CLR, Service Broker, DTC, Database Mail, Machine Learning Services. Those are all in Azure SQL Managed Instance. However, you do not have access to the OS like you do with a SQL VM. And finally, there's Azure SQL Database. This is kind of where a lot of the latest and greatest innovation happens. This is just a database, so you're not going to get those instance scope capabilities that you might be familiar with in SQL Server or Azure SQL Managed Instance, but you are going to get some of the latest innovations, including things like hyperscale and serverless, which we'll talk a little more about what's new in those areas soon. So what we're going to do now that you kind of have that overview, is we're going to step through each of these deployment options and talk about what's new in each of those categories. And then we'll have demos along the way. And then we will also talk about other things that are new across Azure SQL and SQL Server, and other things that are new in the migration space. And I'm going to share resources with you all at the end of this so you can stay up to date, and you can go deeper onto any of the topics that you hear about today. So let's get started. I wanted to start with SQL Server on Azure virtual machines. Now, you'll notice in the past calendar year, there hasn't been a ton that we had to announce from a general availability or public preview standpoint. However, we've been working hard to create lots of documentation, lots of videos, lots of guides to help you get the most out of your SQL Server on Azure virtual machines. We also, near the end of last year, released a storage configuration view in the Azure portal. That's not listed here, and we are still working on that and making that as intuitive and useful as we can for you all. If you haven't seen that, I definitely recommend going and checking that out. We basically allow you to very easily configure all of your different disks and your performance and all of the SQL Server best trace flags for the workload that you intend to use that SQL Server for. So this is really useful. But one thing that we did recently add is this blade for Azure Defender for SQL within the SQL Server in Azure VM view. So now you can see your various alerts there, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about updates across Azure SQL. So that's Azure VMs. Now let's move to Azure SQL Managed Instance. Now, a lot more things on this screen. Let's talk about a few of them. So long-term retention is something for your backups that was available in Azure SQL Database and is now available in Azure SQL Managed Instance. This allows you to keep database backups for up to 10 years, even a deleted database. Maintenance windows is something new in both Azure SQL Managed Instance and Azure SQL Database. And this essentially allows you to specify a time when you want any big maintenance to occur on your database or instance. For example, you can select, weekends at night, and that might be an option that works best for your workload. We also introduced some things around distributed transactions and message exchange with service brokers. So these are things your SQL Server gurus are going to be excited about. We also added Azure Active Directory only authentication, and this is something that also came into Azure SQL Database. But what this means is that before this, you had to deploy with a SQL account. Basically, you had to deploy with some sort of SQL admin. And what this allows you to do is now to not deploy with a SQL admin, or after deployment, disable that SQL admin account and disable all SQL logins and use instead Azure Active Directory only. Now, another thing we just announced recently in public preview is the increased storage limit to 16 terabytes for general purpose. Now, this is something that customers have been asking for a long time. So I know a lot of people have been excited to hear this news. All right, so when it comes to general availability, at the very end of 2019 or 2020, beginning of 2021, we announced ML services with R and Python support in general availability for Azure SQL Managed Instance. This also included ML services custom runtime support, where you can bring your own runtime of Python or R or what have you. And we also announced greatest and least T-SQL functions, which is actually something kind of cool that I'm going to show after this. We released new updates for dynamic data masking. This is something, again, that went across both Azure SQL Database and Azure SQL Managed Instance. And this allows you to have more granular permissions when you're using that dynamic data masking functionality. We have a video where we dive into exactly how this works with both the program manager and the lead software engineer for this capability, which I'll share at the end in the resources. We also announced some things that make using Azure SQL Managed Instance easier. For example, service-aided subnet configurations and parallel backups. So doing parallel backups is going to allow us to do your backups faster and basically with better performance. Finally, we added a new section in the Azure Resource Health, which allows you to troubleshoot connectivity. This is something that's also available in Azure SQL Database. Okay, so we've talked a lot about some updates so far. Let's go ahead and get right into a demo, and I want to show you what's new in Azure SQL Managed Instance. And for this example, it's actually going to apply for Azure SQL Database as well, but I am using Managed Instance in this example, and we're going to show you those new T-SQL functions, greatest and least. So let's take a look. So here you can see I'm connecting to the public endpoint of a managed instance that I have, an AdventureWorks database. And basically what I'm doing here is we have a table called customer accounts, and we want to return the max balance for each customer. So you can see for checking, savings, brokerage, for most of the customers, savings is the greatest value, but for customer ID number 1004, it's actually checking. Now, before these functions were available, we could do a searched case expression to get the resulting greatest balance, saying when checking is greater than savings and checking is greater than brokerage, then use checkings and so on and so forth. We could alternatively use cross-apply, but what makes it really easy is with this new T-SQL functionality, we just have to say what we want. We want the greatest of checking, savings, and brokerage as greatest balance. We don't have to write any extra T-SQL to make that work. We can just make that work high performantly using Azure SQL Database and Azure SQL Managed Instance. So again, that's just a simple example of something new in Azure SQL Managed Instance and Azure SQL Database. Now let's talk about what else is new in Azure SQL Database. A few things are new which are in public preview today, and that includes things that I already mentioned for Azure SQL Managed Instance, like maintenance windows and Azure Active Directory only off. same functionality, same updates coming to Azure SQL Database and Azure SQL Managed Instance. Now, some new things just for Azure SQL Database include private link for Azure SQL Data Sync. This is something that customers have been asking for with the move towards more of a private link connection for all of our services. And related to this is also related to data sync, at least, is also change data capture. And for both of these capabilities, this is something that Mara and myself have done a series of videos on Data Exposed, and Mara has also done a series of blog posts on the Azure SQL Tech community. So those are two things you might want to check out if SQL Data Sync or Change Data Capture are interesting topics to you and your organization. All right, another big one was query store hints. Now, this allows you to basically provide hints to the query store to make changes for specific scenarios. Now, this is really more for those SQL heads, but this is something that a lot of people have been really wowed by, and we have done 2 Data Exposed episodes, one with Joe Sack, kind of like the performance machine behind SQL Server and Azure SQL, and one with Denzel Ribeiro, who has been able to show us how you can load data much faster, much more efficient by using query store hints to help with resource semaphore and memory grants. So there's a lot of different reasons you might use this. Don't have time to go into all of the details for that, unfortunately, today. But again, I'm going to share a resource where you can go as deep as you want in query store hints after this. The other big announcement, which is really exciting, is this idea of blockchain in Azure SQL Database with a new capability called SQL Ledger. Now, the reason this is so exciting is because we're taking the power of blockchain and removing all the complexity and allowing you to leverage blockchain tech in your existing or new Azure SQL databases. So this is huge. We've done some very interesting case studies with various banks and providers that want to leverage this blockchain tech without recreating their whole system or getting all complicated, just using what they have. There's no extra cost for using SQL Ledger. In Azure SQL Database, you just simply have to turn it on, start enabling it, and start enabling it in some tables. Again, there's a lot more to be said about blockchain. We have a short Data Exposed video as well as a deep dive Data Exposed episode. So more things to check out. You're going to hear me say that a lot during the session. It's just like, oh, well, just go check out Data Exposed. And hopefully at the end of this, you're like, wow, I should probably keep up with Data Exposed. All right, so let's move and talk about the general availability announcements. One was Azure Data Share snapshot-based sharing. This came at the very beginning of the year. One GA announcement that was kind of a long time coming was Azure SQL auditing for log analytics and Event Hub. This is something that was in preview for some time. Personally, I love to have Azure SQL Audit go to log analytics, and then I can use something called Custo Query Language, or KQL, which is very easy to learn, to query my logs very easily. However, as part of this GA, they also released support for Azure SQL auditing of Microsoft operations. So what this means is if you open some sort of support case with Microsoft and we have to go do something, we have to go look at your database, we have to go help you with something, blah, 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 see who the users are, see who's trying to log in, anything we do now can be audited. And so this gives you the peace of mind that, just because Microsoft is helping you on a support case doesn't mean they're accessing anything that they shouldn't access, and you can see exactly what it is that they are doing. So that was something that was well received by customers. I already mentioned granular permissions for dynamic data masking and recommended a video for you all to check out. We talked about greatest and least T-SQL functions. Let's see what else is here. Always encrypted with secure enclaves. This is a big one. This one came to SQL Server 2019, but for Azure SQL Database, it took us a little bit longer to figure out just because we had to get that specific hardware, the specific hardware that's required in Azure and configured with our underlying infrastructure for Azure SQL Database. So this came out in public preview, I believe, early in the year, maybe February or March, and then became generally available in, I want to say June. I think it was June or July. But this is something that a lot of customers have asked for, and we've been improving it to allow you to do complex comparisons so that you can actually encrypt and unencrypt without having huge performance impact. So this is something to definitely consider and check out for yourselves. Uh, Finally, I know it's not necessarily new to the product, but new things for Azure SQL Database include two new things on Microsoft Learn. Now, in 2020, you might have been familiar with Azure SQL Fundamentals, which was a full learning path that Bob Ward and myself created on Microsoft Learn, and we also had an accompanying video series. So you could translate your SQL Server knowledge to Azure SQL. Well, it was so well received that we decided to make some more Microsoft Learn modules and Microsoft Learn learning paths. And one of the greatest things about Microsoft Learn, if you haven't used it before, is that it allows you to access free Azure Sandbox resources. So this means for like 2 to 4 hours, you can spin up Azure resources for free. So you can get to know how to use them, how to work with them, and not have to deal with any permissions or funding issues you might have on your personal Azure account. So that's great news. But the two we came out with are build serverless full stack apps in Azure. We released this one around build, and this allows you to get hands-on with GitHub Actions, Azure Static Web Apps, Azure Functions, Azure Logic Apps, and see how all those things integrate with VS Code, the Azure portal, and Azure SQL Database serverless. So that's a really exciting learning path. Of course, I'm biased because I was one of the main creators of this, but would love if you check that out. And we also have an associated video so you can go step by step with myself and Davide Maori. Finally, we have a new module which is coming very soon. By the time you're watching this, I don't think it will have launched just yet, but it will be very close to launching. So I'm here to give you some sneak peek info. We are releasing another module, just one module, where you can get hands-on and deploy IoT solutions with Azure SQL Database. So you can see how Azure SQL Database is going to allow you to ingest millions of events per second while allowing you to have sub-second latency on querying. So this is really powerful, really exciting stuff. I've been having a ton of fun learning about IoT and Azure SQL Database, things like event hubs and Azure Functions. So I can't wait to share it with you in just a week or so. So that's what's new in Azure SQL Database. Of course, I wanted to spend some time to dive specifically into what's new in hyperscale and serverless. Now, for those of you that might not be familiar with hyperscale and serverless, I thought I'd just give like the briefest of introductions about what both of those mean. Hopefully you've been hearing about them, but if you haven't, hyperscale is a very fascinating service tier within Azure SQL Database. And the reason for that is because we essentially took SQL Server apart and we re-architected it to be a cloud native solution. So we're using a series of cache layering and page servers to be able to allow you to have a primary as well as lots of replicas, which I'll talk about, and essentially go beyond the storage limits that we have in the other service tiers of Azure SQL Database and all of Azure SQL Managed Instance. So with hyperscale, you can get up to 100 terabytes in storage, and really this up to is just a theoretical limit. There's nothing physically stopping us from going as big as you need to go. So hyperscale has definitely been really exciting. One of the other things that hyperscale does is it helps with size of data operations. So in other service tiers and deployments, when you scale up or down, it is a size of data operation. So if you have a very large database and you have to scale up or down, this can take some time. Now with hyperscale, there is no dependency on the size of the data because we're essentially moving the primary compute node and the page servers are not affected by that. But what I'm saying is we can scale up and down in constant time. So every time you want to scale up and down, it just takes a matter of minutes. Now, one other thing that's cool about this is because we're using snapshot backup technology, we can actually do backups in constant time as well. So you can restore like a 60 terabyte database in 7 minutes or a 40 terabyte database in 7 minutes, somewhere around there. But in a matter of minutes, you can, back up these huge databases. So that's great news. So lots of great stuff coming out of the hyperscale team, and they're continuing to work towards bringing all the functionality and features and capabilities that you know and love from Azure SQL Database into the hyperscale tier. So that's what you're going to see here with a lot of the preview and GA announcements. We're just bringing Those things available in SQL database general purpose and SQL database hyperscale. We're bringing the things available in Azure SQL database general purpose and business critical service tiers to hyperscale. So things like transparent data encryption with bring your own key support. This is something available in the other tiers of Azure SQL database. We're bringing it to hyperscale. Geo-replication, bringing it to hyperscale. Storage redundancy options, bringing it to hyperscale. Database copy. All these things are already available in Azure SQL database, general purpose and business critical. And now we're kind of bringing that parity into hyperscale. And we're really putting a lot of investment into hyperscale. And I'll talk more about this when I talk about our future. Now, the one thing here that is new to hyperscale and not in the other service tiers is named replicas. So when it comes to replicas, if we think just a second, Azure SQL database generally allows you to either create auto failover groups or geo replicas. So that's great, and that allows you to kind of protect from disaster or do disaster recovery, as well as get some read scale out. Now, hyperscale goes even further than that before we even get to named replicas, in that you can have high availability replicas. So you can choose to configure 0 to 4 high availability replicas. Yeah, 0 to 4. You can have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. These are known as availability replicas because as you increase the number of replicas up to, I think, 2, your SLA or service level agreement with Microsoft also increases as well. So you might choose to enable these for availability purposes, but once you do, you can leverage those replicas for read-only workloads. You can use the application intent read-only to essentially be able to query those read-only workloads. Now, one thing to consider for these availability replicas is that you don't have any insight or control over which replica. So if you had 4 high availability replicas, you don't know when you use application intent read only which replica you're going to, and the compute on these replicas is the same as your primary. So if you have a 4 vCore hyperscale, now you have 4 vCore in your high availability replica. What we even more recently came up with, again, just for hyperscale, is this idea of a named replica. And this allows you to give a name to a replica, and you can put it in the same server or a different server, and you can have it have a different, a different name, but also a different number of vCores. So for example, my primary might have 8 vCores because that's what I need, but I want to run some really heavy reporting, so I'm going to bump up and deploy a named replica for 40 vCores. Now, in this situation, again, spinning these replicas up only takes a matter of minutes because it's not a size of data operation. So you can essentially get read scale on the fly, and you can now connect to all of these using their name as opposed to using application intent read only. So really cool stuff that the hyperscale team is doing, not just in bringing the parity, but even going further to see what customers need with this hyperscale tier and give that to them. On the other side is the serverless tier. Now, just a brief reminder of what this tier is this is a tier that allows you to set the minimum and the maximum vCores. So instead of using provisioned compute like hyperscale does, like business critical does, like one portion of general purpose does, you can choose to use serverless compute. So you set the minimum and the maximum number of vCores, and we're going to take care of auto scaling you on a per second basis of the max of memory or CPU, whatever's higher when you need it. And we're only going to bill you for what you actually need. So we're just going to bill you on a per second basis for how many cores you actually used, as long as that's at the minimum or higher. So that's been great cost savings and performance benefits for customers with intermittent or unpredictable workloads. You don't have to choose between under provisioning and then underperforming, or over provisioning and then overpaying. Now, the other key piece of serverless is you have the option, again, this is just an option, not required, to enable auto pause. So if you enable auto pause, you can set a time, so for example, 1 hour, and after 1 hour, when no one makes any connections to the database, we're essentially going to shut down SQL Server and separate the compute from the storage. Now, during this time, you're only going to pay for storage, which is significantly cheaper than paying for compute and storage. Then, when someone tries to connect to the database again, what we'll do is we'll connect back the compute and the storage. You will start with a cold cache, but then you go back to that min vCore and we scale you up and down based on what you need. So really exciting stuff. We're seeing a lot of adoption of the serverless technology. So if you haven't gotten to play around with it, I definitely recommend checking it out. And again, we're working on bringing those features and capabilities that we have in the other Azure SQL database tiers to serverless. And that's where this zone redundancy comes in. So this is the idea of having multiple availability zones that your data is spread across, so that if one data center goes down, essentially you can fail over to a different one very quickly. All right, so for what's new in Azure SQL database, I want to show you an example of some of the new things that we're doing in hyperscale related to replicas. So let's go ahead and we'll take a look. And what you're going to see is I have a hyperscale database with 16 virtual cores, and I can see some other information, but under compute and storage, what I wanted to show you is those availability replicas. So if I scroll down, what you're going to be able to see is you're going to be able to see the number of vCores, but you're also going to be able to see those high availability secondary replicas. You can see I can scale from 0 to 4 very easily, and this is going to help me with simple read scale scenarios and also improving the availability SLA. So that's one type of replica. Now you also have other replicas that you can configure and deploy. You can see here I have a primary replica. I also have geo replicas. So those are replicas going to a different region. You see it's in South Central US. And then I have this idea of a named replica. And you can see it's actually in the same server as my original. It doesn't have to be, but it has a different pricing tier. It's only 2 vCores. So let's go through the process of creating a new one. It's very simple. I just say if I want a named replica or a geo replica, I can give it a name. I'm going to call it 2 since we already have one. And I can pick which server to put it in, or I can put it in a new server. I'm just going to put it in the same one. It's just easier for me. And then I can configure the database. And let's say I'm going to use this one for extreme analytics. So I'm going to actually, instead of going to 2 vCores, I'm going to scale it all the way up to 80 vCores. I'm going to go ahead and apply that and create it. And it takes just a few minutes to go ahead and kick off that create process and get it deployed. But it really only takes a few minutes, and I've sped through just for time's sake to deploy this thing. And then I can connect to it, and now I have 80 vCores to leverage. Of course, I probably want to delete this when I'm done with this demo, but you can see some of the benefits there of being able to dynamically kind of scale up and scale out as needed. And you can now see down at the bottom, I do have that name replica 2 that's 80 vCores. So it's different from the primary, which can be very useful. So again, just a brief demo to show you kind of some of the new stuff that we're working on in the Azure SQL hyperscale tier, specifically related to replicas. All right, so next, let's talk about some things that are new across Azure SQL. So you heard me talk about a few things that are new across Azure SQL Database and Azure SQL Managed Instance, like granular permissions for dynamic data masking, like Azure Active Directory only authentication. But this is different. This is things that apply across SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machines, Azure SQL Database, and Azure SQL Managed Instance. And one thing that went into public preview in March is Azure Monitor SQL Insights. And you guessed it, we did a short Data Exposed episode and a full Data Exposed deep dive for 1 hour on both of these topics. And myself and Elaine Dormel, the lead PM for this capability, we actually have a session on monitoring at DPS. So I hope you'll join us for that session. Now, we also announced the general availability for Azure Defender for SQL across all of those services. So in the VM, what's new in VM, you may remember that I had called this out as a blade, but this is something that's available in Azure SQL Database, in Azure SQL Managed Instance, and SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machine. This is going to allow you to get things like vulnerability assessment and advanced threat detection where we're basically using machine learning models to identify things like SQL injections or other potential security threats or concerns. So this is a great technology. It's great to see it across Azure SQL. I just hope that you all will check out both of these things. Now, for the what's new across Azure SQL demo, the demo that I have for you all today is related to Azure Monitor SQL Insights. So I'm going to show you a scenario. Again, hopefully this is just a sneak peek and you'll come to Elaine and I's monitoring session. But if you don't get to catch that session, I don't want you to walk away without seeing this solution. So let me go ahead and I'm going to kick off a workload. So I'm using OStress here, which is basically an open source tool which allows me to force a workload or put a workload on a SQL server, an Azure SQL database, or an Azure SQL managed instance. In this case, I'm connecting to Azure SQL database, and what we'll see is that this command should create in about 30 to 40 seconds, and then we'll go see what it looks like in Azure Monitor for SQL Insights. Now, in this scenario, let's assume that this did take about 42 seconds, and that's too long. So we want to go figure out what happened. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to the Azure portal and show you Azure Monitor for SQL Insights. And here in the portal, you see it. And you can see I've set up a monitoring profile and I've set a time range. And you can see I have in the overview information related to Azure SQL Database, Azure SQL Managed Instance, and I can see all of the databases within that. And I even have the ability to see my SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machines. And if I had availability groups configured, I could see that here as well. We have lots of different options here to configure what you see here. For example, I configured some alerts, and these alerts have actually been fired. And this alert is essentially saying if the CPU utilization is too high, then please give me an alert. And these alerts were so easy to set up because I just used a template. But I can also create my own rules or customize them as needed. So since we know there's something CPU related, we might want to check in and look at these databases and try to identify where the issue is. So what you're seeing here is I can actually see an overview across all of my databases, across all my different servers, even if they're the primary replica or the secondary replica. I can see resource info, so I'm looking across my whole estate. And if I take a look at that one database with 99% CPU utilization, I might have found the issue for our previous problem. So we'll dive into that later. Let's see some of the other things we see. Like we can see transactions per second, we can see connections, batch requests per second, we can see any blocks that are happening, we can go into transactions and see what's happening on each of these databases. And my favorite is the Explore metrics, where we can pick from any number of a ton of metrics and split by different ways and see across our databases, across our Azure SQL database servers even in one place. And all of these can be customized, and that's why you see the edit and the save buttons. Now, if we go back to resource info and dive into that one that was giving us some issues, what we're going to see in the overview is I want to take a look at that CPU utilization. And what you're seeing there is that we are being throttled on CPU. So we might want to dive deeper and see, okay, well, what are we waiting on? From the SQL wait stats view, I can very clearly see we're waiting on CPU, and I can even dive into that and see that the most common wait type is SOS schedule or yield, which is usually indicative that I'm running out of CPU resources, which all checks out with everything we've seen so far. So what I can do is I can go into that database, and I'm actually just going to scale it up because now I know. So I'm going to scale it from 2 vCores to 8 vCores. And again, just speed through this, and we're going to run that same workload again. Remember, it took 42 seconds before. We said that was too slow, but because of Azure Monitor SQL Insights, we were able to identify the problem. In this case, it was a CPU issue, and now the workload is repeating in about a quarter of the time. Now, if we come in here and we go ahead and refresh, what we're going to see is you see that spike is much lower in CPU utilization it's, hovering around 60%. So this is just one simple example. There are many other things you could use this for, but this is just one example of how I use Azure Monitor SQL Insights to troubleshoot and address performance, and then confirm that performance has improved after I've taken actions. Again, just remember how easy it was for me to go in and identify that this was a CPU issue on a specific database, and the wait type was SOS scheduler yield. So that's just one example of Azure Monitor SQL Insights. I hope this was enough to get you to either come to our full session with Elaine Dormel, or check it out on Data Exposed. There are a few episodes. All right, so we've talked about a lot of stuff so far. Hopefully you all are still excited and here with me to learn about migrations. So let's start with general availability first. We have been announcing new versions of SSMA, DAMT, DMA, and other tools to basically help you migrate. Now, these are all tools that help you migrate from SQL Server to newer versions of SQL Server, or from SQL Server to Azure SQL, or from something else to SQL Server or Azure SQL, what we call a heterogeneous migration. So we're making a lot of investments here to help you get to whatever deployment option of SQL or Azure SQL that you want to get to. And some of the advancements are really cool. And again, here I go with another Data Exposed plug, but we have a mini series called Migrating to SQL. And I think it's about 7 or 8 episodes where in very small chunks, we walk through all of the capabilities that we've been investing in. So you can see all the different pieces of what's new. Another thing that became generally available, I guess if you would call it that, is the AMP program. So the Azure Migrate program, or AMP program, has been around for, I guess, a few years now. And basically it's a service where you can apply and we will help you migrate regardless of size. We will give you tools, we will give you resources depending on how much workload you want to move. We'll give you best practices, guidance, resources like videos or free training. So that was the Azure Migrate program. Recently, we rebranded or revamped the program, and it's now called the Azure Migration and Modernization Program. So not only are we going to help you migrate your databases and applications, but we're going to help you modernize them. So bring you into modern frameworks, modern tooling, modern ways of securing your data and making it available and performant. So this is kind of cool, and it just kind of recognizes a shift in the mindset as Microsoft thinks about migrations and modernizations. Now, public preview items are really exciting. Maybe you all saw that in March, at the beginning of March, for Spring Ignite, we announced the public preview of assessing and migrating at scale from VMware with Azure Migrate. So this basically allows you to assess your entire VMware estate using one small appliance, and all of those results are going to be pushed up into the Azure Migrate Hub, which allows you to see things like where we're recommending you go, your cost, an idea of your cost, ways to migrate, what to migrate to, what SKU, what's ready, what's not ready, what are the blockers. Gives you one single pane of glass to track your migrations from a database and application perspective. We actually just announced public preview. The database side has been around for a while, but we just announced the public preview of the application side. So we're introducing ways for you to automatically assess and migrate your applications as well, because we understand that when you move a database, you're moving a workload. So you're usually moving a database and an application. So it's important that we support you in both of those efforts. Now, the most recent public preview announcement, I think it's actually was announced the day that I'm recording right now, is migrating from Azure Data Studio to virtual machines or managed instance. And this is what we're calling the migration extension in Azure Data Studio. So we're bringing a lot of tools and experiences that you've been working with or getting to know into one single place. And that's where I want to spend this next demo, this last demo actually. We're going to go end to end through a migration scenario. All right, so let's take a look at Tailspin Toys gaming. So they want to migrate, and we can see they have a very simple web application. They've got some different games. They have a leaderboard, and you can see various things about if users are online or not. So what I'm going to do is show you that we're actually using a very old version of SQL Server. So I'm just going to copy that IP address, and we're going to connect to that SQL Server. And what we're able to see is that running locally, we have Microsoft SQL Server 2008 R2 SP3. So this is I guess the latest SQL Server 2008 version, which is no longer in support. Anyways, I'm going to go over to this Azure SQL migration extension, and essentially we're going to walk through migrating this database server to Azure SQL. So it's really useful. I actually stepped through this for the first time while I was working on this. It just asked me for things like the source credentials and where I want to go to. You can see it actually did an assessment for me. So it's using those DMA tools, and I can see information about if there were any issues migrating to a certain database SKU. Next, I can connect it to my target Azure subscription, and I can select the subscription, the location, the resource group, and the managed instance. So I just have an empty managed instance deployed right now. I can choose an online or offline migration, and I can select somewhere an SMB share, basically, where a user in Azure can essentially reach down, grab these backup files and the transaction log files, and then apply them to that managed instance during the migration process. So we've gone ahead and configured that, and we are using a DMS service. But I didn't have one yet, but we're making it so you can do everything from within this tool. So I can actually create the database migration service from right within Azure Data Studio. It just makes it easier for me. And then the other thing I have to do is install the integration runtime. So this is the only thing that I have to install outside of Azure Data Studio. And again, it's really nice because Azure Data Studio took me to the download and is telling me how to do it. So it's going ahead and installing. And once it finishes, I can get that key and add it to the integration runtime. That's what I'm doing with that authentication key that Azure Data Studio told me. And it's telling me to check the connection. So I'm simply following Azure Data Studio's guidance and able to connect it to that integration runtime. So finally, very simple. In this scenario, I'm able to review all of my choices and select done. So now what happens? Now I can refresh, and what I'm going to see is that there's one database migration in process. I'm also going to get a notification that the migration has started. So I can now click into that migration and start to see the status. I can see, for example, the DMS service. I can see the migration mode is on, and I can see the migration status is in progress. All right, so now that we have that, the next thing I might want to do is actually connect to the SQL Managed instance. So here I am in the Azure portal. I'm just going to grab the connection string for that Azure SQL Managed instance and go ahead and connect to it in Azure Data Studio. So I'm giving it the server name. I'm going to use SQL logins here. So I'm just giving the basically the SQL admin account login here. And I'm getting connected in Azure Data Studio. So now that we're connected, you might be wondering, okay, so what are we going to see? Well, if I go into databases, what you're hopefully going to see, oh, yep, there it is Tailspin Toys is restoring. And that's how it's going to appear while the migration is in progress. And now I can even also click into the database, and I can see the database has been restored, and I can see the last and first LSN, because this is an online migration. So now let's say we are going to make a change to our on-prem database, right? So let's say we've gone ahead and we added a new game. So that's what this very long T-SQL does. It's going to add a new game to the database, and we're going to go ahead and use Tailspin Toys. Again, we're connected to our local SQL Server 2008. We're going to insert the new game, and then we're going to basically push up the log. So we're going to back up the log. Again, remember, the log must be in this shared SMB drive that Azure Database Migration Service has access to. I'm basically going to back up the log, and we can go back into our application. And again, remember, this application is still online and it's connected to SQL Server 2008. And what we'll see now is this new game that we added, which is called Space Adventure. So we see that everything's working in our application and our SQL Server database. Now we can go back to Manage Instance and find if that log is being backed up and restored into the managed instance. So I'm going to go back into the migration status, click on the database, and when I refresh, in just a few moments, what you're going to see, there it is the transaction log, and we can see it's been uploaded. Now, if we assume that we are about ready to perform the cutover, so we want to switch from SQL Server to Azure SQL, we want to make sure the last transaction log has been restored, and that's when we enter the very short time of downtime. So after that, when I'm ready to complete the cutover, I can select that button, and it's telling me all the steps I need to take, like I just mentioned. Stop all incoming transactions, take the final transaction log backup, and make sure all pending log backups are restored, which we saw before. We can see it says 0, so we can go ahead and complete the cutover. So now that the cutover is in progress, what we can do is we might want to check on the status of it. And this usually just takes a minute or so. So we can refresh and we can see the migration status is completing. And so if we give it just a few more seconds, we will be able to hopefully see that it has completed successfully. But in the meantime, what we might want to do is, let's see, if we connect to that managed instance, we can see it's no longer in a restoring state. So maybe that means that it has completed. So if we go ahead and refresh that one more time, we can see the migration status has succeeded. So this is good news. So now if we go back to this view, we can see that there are no migrations in progress, but instead we're going to see that there's one database migration that has completed. Finally, we might want to check and see, we probably should have checked earlier, but we might want to check and see if that new game, Space Adventure, has been added, and we can see that it was updated. So we can see that the online aspect of this migration was successful due to backing up of the transaction logs. All right, now finally, let's change the connection string in our application so we can get back to being up and running. So I'm simply going to change the IP address to point directly to the fully qualified domain name of the managed instance server. And I'm also going to update the username and password if there was a different username and password that we want to use. And in this case, it is. We're going to turn it to SQL MI user. And that's really all I have to change in my application. I should be able to go ahead and run it, and we should see everything performing exactly as it did just moments ago. So if we pull this up, now while it's loading, I will say as part of the migration, we deployed a business critical database, and business critical allows you to actually get an availability group behind the scenes. And well, let's just confirm, yep, we have Space Adventure, so we're in good shape here. But we can see that we're connecting to this leaderboard using a read-write endpoint. Now, because of that business critical availability group that we have, we can use one of those endpoints as a read-only endpoint, one of those replicas in the availability group. So all I have to do is say application intent equals read-only, and that's going to tell Azure SQL Managed Instance to use one of the secondary replicas that is available for read-only workloads. And for things that are only read-only, like reporting a leaderboard, we can use that read-only endpoint. And this is just a simple example to show you that we are actually using the application intent read-only. So I know this was a lot to cover in one demo, but I wanted to show you that end-to-end experience and how Azure Data Studio's migration extension is really making it so much easier. It's just, there's a lot of stuff that goes on, right? But everything is being done from in Azure Data Studio. Everything you need to do outside is being very prescriptive, takes you step by step. So I really love the experience that they put together and the teams put together, and I can't wait to see this product get used by folks like you watching this, by our customers, and get feedback and hopefully make it into GA sometime soon. All right, so we've talked a lot about what's new, and I've shown you hopefully some things you haven't seen before and excited you about what's new. Now, finally, I want to talk about what's next. And of course, I can't share everything about what's next, but I wanted to share some information about the 5 key investment areas that we're heading with SQL. The first is to unify SQL across cloud and on-prem. Over the next few years, we intend to totally blur the lines between cloud and on-prem. Azure Arc has already delivered on part of that vision, but we want to go further. As a customer, you shouldn't have to worry about where you deploy your database, the product, the business model, and data manageability should all be the same. Today in Azure SQL, for example, almost all databases are protected using advanced threat protection, which is part of Azure Defender for SQL. But why restrict these advanced features to cloud? Why only Azure only? Why not protect every SQL database in the world using Azure Security Center? Or have Azure Purview, something new related to governance, provide a single pane of glass across all deployments of SQL, whether it's cloud or on-prem, so you can centrally govern and share data with full lineage. That's just one example. Now, for the modern developer, for today in Azure SQL, we manage over 6 or 7 million databases and I think over something like 10 trillion or 20 trillion queries per day. But there's more work that we want to do to reach every developer. We want to improve the Azure SQL experience with modern frameworks and languages. Things like Django. Actually, Django, we just released a new driver for. Node.js, Angular, Spring.data. We also want to enhance our JSON and graph support in the SQL engine itself. And we want to continue to invest in intelligence for databases, for things like monitoring. You saw with Azure Monitor for SQL Insights, and really just using the power of AI to our benefit and to our advantage. We're also planning to do deeper integrations with services like Azure Functions, Azure Logic Apps, Azure Web Apps, and the Power Platform. Now, I talked a little bit about hyperscale and how excited I am about how we re-architected hyperscale for the cloud. And hyperscale is really going to give us unlimited scale. The page server and log service design is going to help us to deliver the best latency without being restricted to a machine size. We also talked about serverless, which is making the underlying infrastructure adapt to your workload needs when you need them and giving you that price performance. Finally, we didn't talk a ton about elastic pools, but elastic pools are a simple, cost-effective solution to basically have lots of databases and cost optimize and resource share between them. So with Azure SQL, we intend to bring the best of hyperscale, the best of serverless, and the best of elastic pools into a single product offering. So that will be very exciting. I'm excited to see what happens in this space. When we talk about security, and I mentioned this already, we have always been a leader in security, and in order to maintain that leadership position, we are continuously investing and innovating in this space. We talked a little bit about Azure SQL Database, SQL Ledger, so how we're bringing the power of blockchain to Azure SQL Database. And we talked a little bit about Azure Purview, which is a new way of governing data. Our integrations with both Ledger, Purview, and other things like always encrypted with secure enclaves are going to be great investments and great strides to make us be better at confidential computing. Finally, the last thing I want to say is that SQL Server itself is very dear to us. We never plan to slow down. We're going to keep releasing versions in SQL Server, and in the coming versions, we will continue to invest in the core features of performance, reliability, scalability, and bringing that innovation, that industry-leading innovation that we've been doing for so many years. Now, one example of a project we're working on is where we're rewriting parts of the core SQL engine to remove static variables in SQL code with machine learning models that can adapt to your workloads at runtime. So that's just one of the exciting things we're working on. We will continue to invest in a platform that provides a higher level of intelligence and data virtualization and change the way that customers use data platforms. So that's a little bit about our vision. I hope it's interesting to you. It excites me to hear about it myself. The last thing that I have for you all today is hopefully something you've been wanting to know, and that is the resources. I'm going to walk through each of these resources, and then I will bring this slide back up if you want to take like a screenshot or something. So the first thing to know is the Azure SQL News Update blog. So this is aka.ms/news update. Every month, at the beginning of the month, sometime in the first week of the month, I release an Azure SQL News Update blog. And this blog contains all of the different product updates. So for example, in this update, I talked about the Azure SQL migration extension, and then you can get links to videos, links to more information, links to the announcements. You can get links from various things that we're doing. You can see all the videos we've done in the past month, all the blogs, upcoming events, new Microsoft Learn modules, and even my pick of the month. So this is a great resource, and it's the same URL every month. I just update it in the back end, so it's just aka.ms/news update. The next resource is our Azure SQL YouTube page. So if you go to aka.ms/Azure SQL YT for YouTube, you'll be brought to our YouTube page where you can see we release new shorter form episodes every Thursday. And once a month on a Tuesday, we release an MVP episode. So a member of our Microsoft Most Valuable Professional will come on the show. And then every Wednesday at 9 a.m. Pacific, we stream on Data Exposed Live. So we do live shows. You can see we streamed the Azure SQL News Update just an hour ago. And you can see different series we've done, like something old, something new, where Buck Woody and myself walk through various data science scenarios and relating to data science as a data professional. We also have a security series, and we have an Azure SQL virtual machine series. Now, these are longer form series. Each episode is about an hour. We also have a series called Azure SQL for Beginner, where Bob Ward and I, in very short videos, walk through translating your SQL Server knowledge to Azure SQL, from an introduction to deploy and configure, through the meat and potatoes of SQL Server, performance, availability, and security, and finally through putting it all together. There are 60 of these videos, so you can learn at your own pace, or you can dive into something very specific, for example, SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machine. We also have kind of the same content in different forms, for example, in the form of a boot camp where we did 2-hour episodes, or in the form of Azure SQL Fundamentals, which is 6 modules, each an hour and a half long, that were delivered live. Now, Azure SQL Fundamentals is really great because it includes a learning path. I talked about Microsoft Learn. I talked a little bit about this learning path already, but this learning path allows you to get hands-on with Azure SQL, and we do our best to keep this thing up to date. So there's a lot of things in here that you can go try out, and again, you can get hands-on for free with the exercises. Another learning path I wanted to mention, if you're more on the app dev side, is this relatively new module called the Build Serverless Full Stack Apps in Azure. Now, this is going to allow you to get hands-on with, in your language of choice, so Python, .NET, or Node.js. You can get hands-on with Azure SQL Database, with Visual Studio Code, with Azure Functions, with Azure Logic Apps, with, I know there's other stuff, Azure Static Web Apps, and GitHub Actions. So really great place to learn. We chunked it out into 4 different modules, so if you want to focus on a specific thing, you can. Again, they all have free exercises inside that. And then the final resource is SQL Workshops. This is a site maintained by our team, the SQL Server and Azure SQL team. And we post a lot of presentations, workshops, open source stuff on here. So if you want to go deliver this, it's all fair game. So definitely check this out. You can see things like presentation materials from lots of different presenters like myself, Bob Ward, Buck Woody, Pedro Lopes, Ham Lahoud, on and on and on. So this is a great resource. So with that, I'm going to put back up this window so you can take a look at the resources. Maybe you want to pause, take a screenshot. I also wanted to say that I am here when you're watching this. I'm here online. So if you have any questions, I will do my best to answer those questions. So go ahead and put them in the chat. If you have questions later, you can always tag us on Twitter at Azure SQL, or you can tag me or direct message me at Analytic Anna. I hope this session was useful for you all. I also want to thank Amit Bonzel from the DPS team and the rest of the DPS team for putting on yet again just a wonderful event. It's such a pleasure and a joy to get to participate and get to connect with you all in this time where we're so kind of disconnected. But please use this time, ask questions, talk to me on the chat or voice. I am happy to be here for you and help as much as I can. And I'll also say I don't have all of the answers, but it's pretty possible that I do know someone who does. So you can always find a way to reach out to me, and I will try to get you the answer as best as I can. So with that, again, I just want to thank you all for joining us today. It's been a great session, a great conference, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of the conference. Thanks.